Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the CUNY-Initiative on Immigration and Education Workshop Series. CUNY-I, as we call ourselves, is a New York State Education Department funded project that works to create opportunities for educational stakeholders to learn from immigrant students, families, and educators directly impacted by restrictive immigration policies and educational inequality. At CUNY-I, educators, researchers, families, and local leaders work together to learn about, from, and with immigrant communities, act in ways that center our shared humanity, regardless of legal status, and advocate for equitable policies and opportunities. Thank you for joining our workshop series to learn, act, and advocate together. My name is Khadidra Martin. I am a doctoral candidate in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm also a research assistant with CUNY-I, and my daughter, Emanika, is an alumna of the Flanbwayan program, which you'll learn a little bit more about soon.
And my name is Jenna. I'm your other kind of facilitator, I guess, for lack of a better word tonight. I'm also a research assistant at CUNY-I and a graduate student in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I'm also a proud member of the educator team at the New York State Youth Leadership Council. So I'm super excited about tonight and all the kind of organizing connections, and I'm sure there's many in the audience as well. So we're happy to have you here. Khadidra, I'll kick it back to you for kind of a ground setting, Norm.
Absolutely. So CUNY-I, we believe deeply in community and justice. And as we hope is illustrated in our grounding principles, which we'll link to in the chat. So I'm putting our grounding principles in the chat here. We want to hear all voices, so the chat is open. We hope that it will be an active place for conversations, resources, jokes, laughter, joy, and ideas. However, if there is any harmful, abusive, or demeaning language in the chat, we will remove that person or people. Abuse and violence of any kind will not be tolerated in this space. And as a note, credit goes to the Coalition for Educational Justice for this framing, okay? So thank you all very much. And I'm gonna turn it back over to Jenna to introduce our panelists.
I have the pleasure of introducing four amazing, amazing organizers and educators today. And I'll introduce them quickly because I want to give them the floor as soon as possible. So we have Darnell with us from Flamboyant, Simran from RAISE, or Revolutionizing Asian American Immigrant Stories on the East Coast, Gabby from the New York State Youth Leadership Council, or YLC for short, and Jaime from ImmSchools. As a note, most of these organizations are based in New York City, and we just want to recognize that CUNY-I is actually a statewide initiative. We were in conversations with folks who are organizing in Buffalo as well, but they unfortunately weren't able to make it tonight. But I just want to acknowledge that because I think it's important to say that we recognize that organizing at the intersection of education and immigration is not something that happens only in urban spaces. So I am going to kick it over to the panelists. If y'all could introduce yourselves and your organizations a little bit more in 3 to 4 minutes and just talk about how your work is centered at the intersection of immigration and education. So Darnell, if we could start with you, that would be great.
Okay, hello everyone, happy to be here for this great discussion. Flamboyant Haitian Literacy Project, I'm happy to say, is celebrating 16 years of service in the community, 16 strong years of organizing on immigrant education reform. And I'm happy that we get to have these conversations because sometimes it feels like, okay, are we the only ones, you know, screaming out of the lack of opportunities for immigrant students. When I started this work back in 2005, Haitian students were the third biggest immigrant population in the public schools. I've brought a lot of numbers just to frame like the work that that I do and that we do inside the organization. My name is Donnell Benoit. I'm a Black immigrant. I'm a mother from Haiti. I came also an English language learner. I tell people I'm still an L because I still have to read things 3 times sometimes, okay? So, which is, there's nothing wrong with that, which is great. I went to school in the 80s, and then I felt that there were more opportunities, and all of a sudden I became an ESL teacher in the community and realized, wow, immigrant students were dropping out of school. They were being pushed out of school. And as ESL teacher, I worked in different communities in New York City. New York City, we all know it's a big immigrant community, and I've done it all. And the problems are the same with immigrant communities when it comes to immigration and immigrant education. Our schools lack resources, they lack support, they lack, you know, friendly people, they lack teachers with experience, they lack resources, they lack money, they lack so much for our students that immigrant graduation is at 35%. And the general population is at 73%. That's a huge gap. Our work, we want to, I know people say bridge the gap or make it the same. We want to narrow that gap. I think that's the work. We want to narrow the gap so that immigrant students can experience success like all students. I'll stop right there.
Simran, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all for organizing this super important topic. Yeah, so I'm Simran. I'm the community organizer for RAISE, Revolutionizing Asian American Immigrant Stories on the East Coast. A lot of our work has really focused on and centered undocumented API or like Pan-Asian youth. A lot of it has been storytelling. A lot of our work is focused on political education. So another sort of like lens on what education looks like. A lot of our outreach has been to, you know, New York City schools and colleges as well. We internally also a lot of political education with our members, really focusing on like how can we use the lived experiences and the material realities of immigrant communities to then inform our organizing. And then also sort of like seeing, basically filling in the gaps where a lot of schools sort of fail us, and serving as a home for undocumented API Pan-Asian youth, because there isn't really an organization or a place for a lot of undocumented Pan-Asian folks, especially young people. So that is a little bit about RAISE in terms of sort of like our connections to education. Spoke a little bit about it in terms of like connecting with schools, figuring out what resources students really need, trying to fill in those gaps. And then internally really focusing on like, how are we politicizing? How are we really focusing on our membership and showing that, you know, a lot of our liberation is connected to other folks, and then organizing through that. I'll pass it on.
Gabby, I think you can follow up to that.
Yeah, hi everyone. Again, thank you for having us here. My name is Gabby. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the education manager at the New York State Youth Leadership Council. So the New York State Youth Leadership Council is the first undocumented youth-led organization in New York. We work to empower immigrant youth through leadership development, grassroots organizing, educational advancement, and self-expression. Our goal is to give undocumented youth the tools and space to organize and create change in our communities. So a little bit of background of the New York State Youth Leadership Council. So the New York State Youth Leadership Council came about in 2007, and it came about when other immigrant rights organizations were meeting for the DREAM Act. And youth realized like we actually need our own space because we have different struggles compared to maybe our parents or elders. So that is where the New York State Youth Leadership Council was pretty much born from. And it was the New York State Youth Leadership Council youth in 2010, 2011 that actually wrote the bill that we now know as the New York DREAM Act. It's been altered a lot, but it's now folks can apply to the New York Dream Act. So a lot of our organization is heavy on education, but also on political education. So as we're trying to go to college or try to get access to rights in our schools, in public schools, we're also learning and navigating how to advocate for ourselves. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the overview.
Jaime, last but certainly not least.
Awesome. Thank you so much for, again, having us, Jenna. So my name is Jaime and I work for ImmSchools as a program facilitator. ImmSchools has been around fairly recently. We've been founded over the last 5 years. And what we are is an immigrant-led nonprofit with our goal being transforming schools to be safe and welcoming for undocumented students and families. And I'd say ImmSchools is really born out of the shared experience of many undocumented youth. So for context, I grew up undocumented in New York and New Jersey, and through my scrappiness and resilience was able to attain a college education. But unfortunately, we know that's not the experience of many undocumented youth across the country, right? And I was also very lucky because I was able to qualify for DACA. And after qualifying for DACA, I actually became a teacher as a way to give back to the immigrant community and work with immigrant youth and their families. But as a teacher, I also realized that a lot of my immigrant students and their families solely came to me, right? When they had questions regarding, can I apply to FAFSA? Can I do this? Can I do that, right? And I realized that a lot of the resources that I had as an undocumented immigrant, folks, other teachers who may not have had that experience didn't know how to support their students. And so through this idea of sharing kind of our experiences as undocumented folks and the resources that we've used to navigate this school system, we created ImmSchools as a way to provide educators with the tools and resources they need to support undocumented students and families in the K-12 education system. Beyond that, we also work with families to provide workshops on what their rights are, how to build community and advocacy within their own communities. And we also advocate for immigrant-friendly policies, both at the school, local and state level, specifically in Texas, New Jersey, and New York right now.
So I hope, audience folks, if you weren't already excited and understanding how amazing our panelists are, you're excited now. I was a little nervous at the beginning and now I'm just excited. So once again, welcome. So we're gonna jump into the panel portion. Just a quick overview of how today is gonna go. So we'll have a couple questions from Khadija and myself as moderators for the panelists. If you're in the audience and questions pop up during the panel, we invite you to put those in the chat. Khadija and I will be monitoring the chat. And then we should have 20 to 30 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. We really want this to be a conversation with all of you. So whenever something comes up, throw it in the chat and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible at the end. I think, yeah. So our first question, and maybe we can we can start in the order we did introductions, and then maybe we can go in the reverse order for the second question. But for the first question, I know some of our panelists touched on this already, but I'm really excited to dive into this. How do you define education? And Darnell, once again, we'll start with you.
Okay. Is it because I'm older than everybody here in the panel? Okay. For me, I mean, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, I'm from a family of educators. So I love that question because I think defining education for everyone, for us, and the way other people define education for us is different. I like to use something that the EDC, the Educational Development Center, uses. It says the power of literacy lies not only in the ability to read and write, but rather in an individual's capacity to put those skills to work in shaping the course of his or her own life. That's from Paulo Freire, with the insight that genuine literacy involves reading the word and the world. I think for us educators in the field that we're in terms of political education, advocacy, and working at the intersection of immigration and education, and the experiences and the lived experiences of our students, we have to take everything into consideration. It's not about now, okay, low literacy, not literacy, how do you can read this, it's not just about reading. It's about learning the world around us. And I think as community organizations, I think that's what we're picking up that slack, because the schools don't understand that this is what they need to do, that that education is not just confined inside the walls, it's also everywhere. So that's important. So this is from renowned educator Paulo Freire. He helped open the door to a broader understanding of the term, one that moves from a strict decoding and reproducing of language into issues of economics, health, and sustainable development. His views of literacy is practical and all-encompassing. Whether it is the words of a language, the symbols of a math problem, or images posted to the internet, literacy can transform lives. So we have to decode everything around us. It's not book specific. It's not passing an exam. It's not, those ISEC exams that our students have to take. It's not, showing up every day, because, some of our students cannot show up to school every day. It's not going to school from 8 to 2:30. How about evening classes? How about weekend classes? It's so much. It's meeting our students where they're at. It's really connecting with them, engaging with them, and really, helping them to learn the world around us. And I think during this pandemic, we realized that many of the schools don't even have computer literacy. They've never taught our kids how to use a computer, and look what we're in now today, right? The whole ideas of, you need to open doors, just like what Jaime said. It's important. He had to find that on his own. We want our students, even though they're not finding, schools are not giving it to them. They don't have the families that can give it to them. They don't have the community organization, but they need to learn the world around them so they can find it out for themselves. So to me, that's what education is all about. And getting into the advocacy work, getting into organizing, leadership development, that's what we're teaching our students. We're helping them to really read the world. That's it.
Simran, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. No, I think there were so many gems in that, and what Darnell's already said, but sort of like building off this point, right, that like education is not confined in like the four walls of a school. It's not confined in the ivory tower, right, like in universities and colleges, right? I think so much of education comes from, the people who are, a lot of times people in universities are studying them, right? Like a lot of times people in universities are studying immigrant communities, right? We hold so much power and knowledge within ourselves. It's just like being able to name that, right? So I think a big part, like for us, a lot of what education means, right, is a lot of it's like politicizing folks, right? Is like, how do we name these like conditions that we are currently living in, and what are we doing, right, to change the conditions? Like, what are the methods and tools to do that we can use to change our conditions, right? So more so using education as a tool of change, right? That's sort of how we like have moved through our work, really centering like the experiences and the stories of our membership, of folks in our communities, and using that as like educational tools, right, for folks who may not know like what the experiences of undocumented API folks is, what that looks like, right? How that may differ, and there's similarities between different like undocumented immigrant communities, right? So for us, that's sort of how we see education, using it as a tool of change, to politicize folks, to really be able to organize and mobilize folks, and really going beyond like creating awareness, like in people who may not know that much about like undocumented API communities, right? but really working to like make sure that everyone can be organized, everyone can be like agents of change in communities and changing the conditions that we currently are in. And I'll leave it at that.
Gabby?
Yeah, thank you. There's so much that you both shared. I think education is collective learning. I think it's sharing with each other. I think it's looking at our communities and seeing like what is already there, the magic that is already there, the knowledge that's already there. I think sometimes, a lot of times, education can be very elitist. It could be like we have all these degrees and all of that, and that defines education. Um, but I think for us, it's really tapping into each other, tapping into youth as well, and also acknowledging that youth have so much knowledge and they know what they need and they know what they want um, in their communities and for their families. So, really, that collective learning is so important, and I think that really defines education. Um, I think education is also power, right? If we can name some of the things that are happening in our communities, right, it's easier to identify them. It's easier to advocate. And I think a huge part of like why education is power is because folks can then advocate for themselves, right? It's easier when you have that language. So um, yeah, and I think that ties into both like political education and also just navigating the systems, right? Like public education, trying to get to college, trying to figure out how to do the New York Dream Act application, all of these things, right? And we do need that language to navigate them. So it's very important.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, and certainly kind of like agree with the more humanistic take on education, right? Emphasizing learning for learning's sake and really using it as a tool to think critically and to be active in your community. But I also want to bring up kind of just like a more narrow, like literal view of what education is and like why I decided to become a teacher, right? Like to me, like living in a capitalist society, education equals opportunity, and you need a diploma to access those opportunity, right? That's the sad reality of it. And so, thinking back to my time in the classroom, one of the mottos that my school had was that, education is a tool for positive multi-generational change, which I know is a mouthful, right? Positive multi-generational change. I really had to think about it. And unfortunately, we have policies within the K through 12 system and even schools themselves, like individual schools, have policies that actually make it more impossible for immigrant students and immigrant families to be able to access a diploma, right? Be it in high school or college. And so to me, the way I see education right now, it's very limiting in terms of who is provided access specifically for the immigrant community. I know that was rambly, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I want to kind of uplift and appreciate what all of you are saying. I think a lot of what I'm hearing is about how education goes beyond school walls. It's about learning about the world around us and thinking about how to change it, which, knowing your 4 organizations, is not surprising. But I think as someone who is also an educator, not all educators realize that, and I think it's important to emphasize that so that educators hear that. And I also think I appreciate, Jaime, what you're saying and what I know a lot of your orgs do, which is thinking about how to not just organize in community outside of schools, but also work to change policies in schools and other formal institutional learning spaces. Something I'm also hearing a lot that I want to uplift is the need to center relationships and community, and particularly center directly impacted folks in leading that change. Youth, undocumented folks, immigrants, language learners, and all of that. And I think we're in an interesting position as CUNY-I, both as a space that's in a formal university, but also a space that's looking to work with communities to create change. And so there's a reason that learn is the first part of our kind of learn, act, and advocate. So I just wanted to name that as well. And we all have work to do. And so I think the second question we have follows up really well on the first, and I think we have a lot to learn from y'all, which is how do you integrate the voices of youth and or directly impacted folks in decision-making and advocacy efforts in your organization? And let's go in reverse this time. So Jaime, we'll start with you.
Cool, awesome. Thank you so much, Jenna. So as an immigrant-led organization, one of our values is really centering those directly impacted in all aspects of our work, right? So we are deeply committed to centering our students and their families in our advocacy efforts. So last year, for instance, we interviewed undocumented parents who provided us with recommendations around school safety and implementation. This was obviously before the pandemic and had a lot of optimism in terms of how we would use those recommendations. But in any case, we did the same throughout the pandemic and were able to make changes to our overall strategy after interviewing those parents, right? This month, for instance, we also hosted focus groups with students across our regions to help us continue to develop these strategies as we continue to grow as an organization. So we really involved them from the kind of like very top in terms of just like pointing us in the right direction with regards to our strategy. But beyond that, like I said, these students and these families have also impacted our COVID response. So we really started with them when thinking through how it is that we're going to support our community through the pandemic, right? So we're able to provide them with financial assistance to our 200 families. We were also able to increase communication and resources with them by creating WhatsApp groups, as well as shifting our programs to virtual contexts and co-creating these spaces with them. So all that to say is there's also constant communication between us and our community, who we also see ourselves as being part of. And we're looking forward to continuing to doing these strategies over the next few years as we continue to grow as well.
Thank you, Jaime. Gabby?
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So we are Undocumented Youth-led organization. So everybody that has a leadership role in our space is immigrant or undocumented. Mostly everybody, except I think for 2 people, are undocumented in our space. And it's just natural because the people that are leading are the ones that are also making decisions, are also part of the community. But we also acknowledge that youth, undocumented youth, also have families. So taking that into account, but always with the focus of the youth that are in our space. And I guess ways I can show how we've been doing this is we realized from our members that there was a lot of college access programs, a lot of programs to get higher education, but a lot of the times these programs excluded undocumented folks. And 2 members of our organization, the co-director and one of our youth members that was still in high school, created a whole program called the Undocu Academy. And from that program, it was specifically only for undocumented youth to be able to access college or know more information, or not even just college, but know like a plan after high school. And so it was created by undocumented youth still in high school. It was created by undocumented youth still in college. And then the people leading this program are also undocumented and are still in college, actually. So I think part of all of that, right, is we are the voice of the organization. Undocumented youth are the voice of the organization. And that also goes with the dream teams, the dream team network that we have. It was undocumented youth that started in 2010. And dream teams are now like in a lot of spaces. And it's because we needed that space. Colleges didn't have it. High schools didn't have a space where we can get together as a community and ask questions. So it was youth that really, were like, we have a need, we need this space, and they went out and did it. So yeah, I think that's how we incorporate. I think it's like a vital part of everything we do.
Amen.
Yeah, similar to Gabby and YLC, our organization is also led by, made up of all undocumented API folks, very much so, like at the center of everything that we do, any decisions that are made, any projects that we do. It's always led by undocumented API youth. A lot of folks like specifically don't have DACA either. So like folks who really do not have any sort of like protection legally, right? Some of the ways that we've like, a lot of the work that we've done has been cultural work, has been sort of like educational work. Two sort of examples that come up, we had to amplify her zine, which was basically highlighting the stories of undocumented Asian women. And so that was, all of that was like curated, written, all the art was done by undocumented Asian women. We also had the Undocu Asian theater performance a few years ago, which is like the first theater performance for done by undocumented Pan-Asian youth, basically highlighting the stories, the various like diversity of stories of undocumented Asian youth. So yeah, everyone in our membership and on our core team they're all undocumented Asian folks. We really make sure that we center their decisions, sort of like things that Gabby has already said, and like uplifting that again, because they know best, right? Like folks who are the most impacted know best of like, okay, this is what we want to do, right? So that's a little bit about us and how we've sort of done that.
Darnell, I think you're muted.
Okay. For us, we work with Haitian immigrant youth at the high school level, and that begins for us. Students are not even like entering high school. Entering high school has been a huge deal, a huge problem for immigrant students and immigrant communities. And for us, it's a lot of political education, a lot of cultural programming, leadership development, and so forth. But young people realize as soon as they enter here, I know from back home, this is typical of swapping immigrant stories. Everything is golden here. Everything is great. It's wonderful. It's beautiful, and so forth, right? But when these young people, they get here, enrolling in high school, they're like, wow. All of a sudden, you go to the Family Welcome Center that many people don't know about that center, right? It's not a welcoming place at all. And then you get all these roadblocks, you know, people are mean, people are racist, they don't understand, you know, how to speak to people properly. They're not polite at all. They don't understand, you know, they don't know where you come from. They know that you don't speak English, but they act as if that you do. The families are frustrated. People cry at the Family Welcome Center. So these students have been encountering that, and this is from the beginning of the work of the organization. So this was something, our most recent, very successful campaign, Your School, Your Choice, was within a coalition of organization and young people throughout the city. We have it in the 5 top languages. It was about having the right to access to high school. In New York City or in the state, high school is up to 21, but there is really like students who tend to be 17 to 21, they really mistreated them because schools don't want you in the schools because, you know, you bring their numbers down in terms of graduation rate and so forth. And then they feel like they just didn't have time for you. And often immigrant students, just because they're 17, they weren't like, you know, a true 11th grader or 10th grader. They had to start from the beginning as a 9th grader. And many schools refuse to do that. So we took that work, the organization Flanbwayan, and our youth. Our youth have made a film We made a huge poster. And the last thing was, having a huge campaign around it, going to city council, working closely with the DOE, with the Division of Multilingual Learners. But immigrant students still don't have access to many types of schools within the system. So it's not equal, right? Education is not equal, but we want equal education, not just education for all. That's what they say, education for all. We want equal education for all, because that leaves out immigrant students. There are 1.1 million students in the public school. 15% of those students are immigrant students. That's 160,000 students that they're leaving out of education, of really leaving them. We say undocumented because 1 out of 3 students drop out, right? So that means they're not getting a high school diploma. And we know when our students don't get a high school diploma, the DOE doesn't see them. We see them in the community. We know what happens when students don't have enough documentation to really to really move on to do whatever they want, because that's what the education is supposed to be about, right? You're supposed to be able to go and be whoever you're going to be. It's not college if you don't want to go to college, but it's so many other things. So our campaign led us to really reform the family welcome centers, where families are able to feel welcome, students are able to feel welcome. Our students have shared with the family welcome center staff. There are 13 centers throughout New York City. They've gone to all of them and trained the people working there. And it was amazing. They were like, we never realized that it was that hard. They never realized that coming from the students sharing their experiences, they never realized how hard it was, because this is your first, basically for many families, many of our students have green cards. So this is the first bureaucracy space that they're going into, and they're having that kind of a reaction. So it leaves them, really hardened and soured by that experience. So they were able to go and share their experiences with the staff, with the Family Welcome Center staff, and that has made a huge difference in the way they welcome the students, in the way that regular students leaving 8th grade going into high school, you have a whole year to decide that decision, to make that decision. But immigrant students really had 2 minutes in front of someone, okay, throwing schools at you. And there are 600 high schools. You don't know which school it is. So a lot of work, we did a lot of work. Our youth has done, and other youth throughout the city was a part of this work. And now that has made it easier for students to access education. So that was a first big step, entering high school here. So we're happy about that. And the rest now, the fight doesn't end, right? Continue on fighting to have education, right, in the schools.
Thank you all. Super exciting to hear that. And I just want to uplift what I'm hearing, which is that it seems like all of you are really embodying what you're saying education is in the various campaigns that you're engaging in. And so once again, I think we have so much to learn. Khadija, I'm going to pass it over to you for our next question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for giving us such rich descriptions of what your organizations have been doing. So we heard, so far that you all have had immigrant youth involved in leadership roles, making decisions, creating campaigns, composing various kinds of texts and media about issues that directly affect their communities. And so our next question is, what do you think educators need to know? Educators, in schools, outside of schools, what do they need to know when working with immigrant communities? So anybody can start who'd like to.
I can start. I don't know if, okay. I can start. They need to know a lot. I just wanted to support what, when I had raised my hand before with the first question, I was gonna say, but Jaime said, I became an ESL teacher in immigrant communities because I had figured it out for myself and I wanted to help other immigrants to figure it out. So to me, that was the basis for my teaching and my classes. And I feel that my students felt that, because they felt that I gave them the space to be, and together we could be and figure it out. So I think as an educator myself, that's what I want for for students. And also I want collective success for educators to understand that it's not about, the star student, the one student that, oh my God, the students gets it, blah, blah, blah. But the students can be successful, that's great, but how about the whole class, right? How about all the other immigrant students that are sitting in the back, that are trying to understand what you're saying? I think that collective success is important for an educator to understand, not only in the classroom, in a school, in a community, because it's when all of us are successful, not just the 5 students, okay? When all of us are successful, I think that's when real success, we can gloat about real success. I think educators need to know that all parents want the best for their children. All parents, no matter where you are in the world, in New York City, okay? You want the best for your children. I think educators need to understand that all students are the same. Also not the same. And I think sometimes, it's up to educators to do the work to find out who the student is. Where is the student from? Oh, the student is from Yemen? Oh, I don't know anything about Yemen. Let me find out. I think that's your job as an educator to do. Immigrant students bring a wealth of knowledge to the classroom, right? And I think educators dismiss that, schools dismiss that, right? They always think they have to start from zero, like a 17 or 18-year-old is reading a baby book, okay? Come on, I think, they need to understand that they need to do the work themselves to meet that student where that student is at, because that student has a lot to share. Culture is huge. This is New York City. What I hate that I find in the work, when they say, oh, Latino, okay, Latinx, yeah, but that's many countries, okay? She may be from Guatemala, he may be from Panama. The cultures are different. They don't understand that. All the Black students, yeah, some of them are from Africa. Really, Africa is not a country, okay? There are many countries in Africa. The Senegalese students are different from the Ghanaians, for example. So they put all that together, and so it's disrespectful, right? And educators are missing on that. They need to not limit the students. Don't put immigrant students in a box, right? Oh, they can do this, they can do that. And I think that's how immigrant students are missing on so many opportunities, because, oh, you can do this, you can do that, you don't speak English well enough, you have an accent, or this and that, all this BS that we don't need in the classroom. We need to be totally supportive. All students need support. We all know, if there isn't support in the classroom, if there isn't support in the community, if there isn't support at home, a teacher makes a huge difference in providing that support. And the schools need to understand that immigrant students are not like all students, because you need to understand where that student is coming from. You need to understand the student's needs, because you cannot find that a student is undocumented when you're applying for college. That's a huge problem for many schools, right? And they don't know how to handle it, because there isn't anyone that has the experience. The school is not immigrant friendly, and they don't have the experience for that. And then immigrant students, the schools, educators think because the parents are not in their face all the time, because parents are working, immigrant parents are working hard to provide for their kids. That doesn't mean they're not engaged. That doesn't mean they don't care about education. I think that's a false, hood for the whole system, right? I give myself as an example. My mother worked 16 hours a day, but that doesn't mean when she got home, you did your homework and she followed up through. Parents are doing that at home, trust me, okay? They're not just leaving the kids loose and not doing anything. They may not understand what's going on, but they're there to support their kids. And educators take this as a disadvantage, right? Oh, okay, no one is showing up for that kid, then therefore I can treat them any way I want. Parents, encourage their students. Engagement is different in different communities, right? Immigrant parents often think that the school is responsible for everything, so I don't have to do anything. We just have to learn the different cultures, right? Not every parent will be on top of the school. And then the last thing is, educators need to, immigrant students have real world responsibilities often, right? They have to care for a younger sibling, that's the culture. They have to work at home. They have to work, right? To support the family, not just to buy sneakers and pay for phone bills, right? So all that they need to understand so they can better serve our students.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow. Such wisdom, such really important information that you shared with us. Anybody like to add on, uplift what
I
Darnell's
was
talked
going
about?
to I was
Okay,
going to say
Jaime.
thank you so much for sharing, Darnell. I don't know how much more color I can add to that discussion, but in any case, I think two parts of what you said. You said a lot of great things, but two parts I specifically want to double down on is just the idea of, diversity within the immigrant community. Back when I was in high school applying to college, I know that a lot of immigrant advocacy groups and a lot of scholarships that were offered to undocumented students were actually specifically for Latinx students, which is great, right? But as a Filipino American who's undocumented, for me, that meant that I didn't have a ton of resources, and there are already not a lot of resources, right? So kind of like opening up the definition of educators to like institutions and saying, hey, when we're considering solutions or aid for those who are undocumented, they're not just all Latinx, right? I actually was leading a session to a bunch of educators on supporting undocumented students. And this was at a school that was predominantly serving Black families and Black students. And I had an educator walk out on that session saying that immigration wasn't a Black issue, right? Which we know is not the case. And so that's something I want to emphasize, right? But also I think at ImmSchools, one of our focus areas this year, especially given this pandemic, is providing families and students with resources to create more positive mental health, right, and more positive social emotional well-being. And we've been able to host sessions for educators, specifically talking about how they can infuse trauma-informed practices into their classroom. Because to your point, Darnell, right, when students walk into the classroom with their head down, it's not because they don't want to learn, it's really because a lot of the policies that we have as a country are very restrictive to immigrants. And so this causes a lot of our students and their families to carry a lot of trauma day in and day out. And we certainly know that that becomes a barrier when it comes to learning. So I guess the synthesis there is, telling educators that, we should be adopting more trauma-informed practices in the classroom.
Thank you, Jaime. Again, such really important things. Simran or Gabby?
Yeah, no, Darnell, you like hit all the points. That was so great. Thank you. And Jaime as well. But I want to talk about how sometimes a youth are expected to educate educators on their statuses. Um, and I think Darnell, you mentioned this, right? Like educators should be doing their own research, right? It's okay not to know what, but I do expect educators to know something, especially if you're living in New York. Um, but don't ask like students and youth to tell you like what is SIDGE or what is DACA or like this is something you can do on your own. A lot of times it's also very traumatic for folks to reshare what that is and to reshare their story and to reshare their status. So I think it's also educators have to know this, especially if you want to be an ally or an accomplice to immigrant students. You should know some of these legal terms. So if a student comes to you, you're not like blindsided. Another thing also I want to mention is that yes, immigrant youth and undocumented youth, we do have a lot of struggles, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a voice. So it's so important for educators as allies and as accomplices to listen to what the youth need instead of dictating what they need or assuming what they need. So that's so important, I think. And then another thing also is educators do have power, right? We can dismiss the power dynamics that is with educators and youth. So educators have a power dynamic that they are invited into closed spaces where students are often not invited into those spaces, right? And it goes back to having like a degree or having, further education. And that is a privilege that educators can use for undocumented youth, right? So if you're invited into like a DOE space, or you're invited into a conference with the principal, or folks that can actually create change, make sure you're advocating for undocumented youth in those spaces that we are invited in. So those are what I would tell educators to do. But yeah.
I think everyone has touched on like every single point. The only thing that I would sort of add or uplift, right, is this idea of building, and I think this has been the thread throughout what folks have been saying, is like building genuine relationships with students. Because I think a lot of times that's where the disconnect is, right? Educators are not building genuine relationships with students. They're not actually getting to know students. They're not getting to know like, okay, what is going on at home? Like what's creating the conditions that you can't turn in your homework? You can't, show up to class on time, right? Like really getting to the root of it, and then figuring out as an educator, because as Gabby said, like there's power dynamics at play, like figuring out where can you fill in those gaps as an educator, right? In the capacity and role that you have, how can you help students' success, right? Also, uplifting Jaime's point around there's not a one size fits all for every single immigrant student, right? The needs of like undocumented API students is going to be different from an undocumented Latinx student, right? So also understanding that like, there's this, folks are not, undocumented folks, immigrant communities are not a monolith. There are different needs for different communities. And really figuring out, okay, like what can I do to uplift this specific student? What are the tools and resources that I can use? How can I advocate for this student? How can I help them find their voice as well, and make sure that, they have the tools that they need to succeed? And yeah, that's all I'll add on that.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I just want to, just to highlight some of the things that I heard that we named as being really important. Starting with, focusing on the collective, right? The importance of collective success. In many immigrant cultures, we know that that the community is important, right? And that the goals of the community, the family, is really important. And so these are values that many of our immigrant students bring to the classroom that we need to know, and that we can, we need to uphold, that will motivate them. When we think about what motivates students, right? But we need to really know what their culture is and kind of what their cultural values are to have a better understanding of what could possibly motivate them. And then, many of us talked about the importance of learning about specific cultures of students, right? One of our guiding principles is that, is that the immigrant experience is beyond the Latinx experience, right? So that and the immigration is complicated. So that we really need to understand that, that really immigration affects all racialized groups in the United States, every single one, right? And we need to understand that. The diversity within the immigrant communities. And so it really, I think, and then Jaime's point about, the importance of understanding how U.S. immigration policies, how it enacts trauma, right, on many of our families, our communities. So we need to really focus on the mental health of immigrant youth, and have trauma-informed practices in the classrooms. So I think, in summary, trauma-informed practices, and what I'm hearing is that culturally sustaining and responsive education. So this is something that's becoming a buzzword, especially in New York City, right? And in New York State, we recently adopted, New York State has adopted this framework of culturally sustaining and responsive education. So it sounds like we're saying that if we really want to do this work effectively, then we've got to really pay attention and listen to our immigrant communities and understand the specificities of their culture and not think of them as a monolith, right? So thank you all. And what we're going to do now is we are going to go into the questions from the audience. Okay, so there are a couple that we've collected along the way. I want to encourage those of you in the audience, if you've been kind of sitting on a question, if you've been inspired by something, then please, you can add your questions now in the chat, and we will collect them and try to get to as many as possible. And of course, and from for these questions from the audience, panelists, you don't all have to answer it, feel free, if you feel so guided and motivated, maybe one or two people, can answer each of the questions, right? And then we'll try to get through as many as possible, okay? So the first question that came through was about immigrant students with disabilities, okay? So Marianne had the question, how have the efforts put forth by all of our panelists affected immigrant students with disabilities? Has the disability community been included in your work? What does advocacy look like for immigrant families of students with the most significant disabilities? Okay, so this kind of, is thinking about the issue of intersectionality, right? People who are, when we think about people who are from multiply marginalized social groups. So, on the one hand, we have students who are immigrants, who may be undocumented, and then they also may be from, from a marginalized, racialized background, right? Or they may also have a disability. So, maybe you all, if you want to talk to the specific idea of immigrant students with disabilities, or generally about intersectionality, like how do you handle, issues of maybe race and gender, or socioeconomic class, or other kind of marginalized identities of community members who participate in your programs. So, anybody like to start?
Yeah, I'll answer that because this is something that's been very difficult. I mean, for our organization, we don't even touch on that. But the system as a whole doesn't either. I talk about the DOE, we're in New York City, so I'm only talking about New York City, the education system here. It's a pyramid. Immigrant students are here, the English language learners, and students with disabilities are under them, okay? Those are the two struggling groups. The two struggling groups in the system. And this group at the bottom, especially immigrant with disabilities, English language learners, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. We need to do so much more. Not only our organization, but the city as a whole. These students suffer. They suffer in the public school system because I've been doing this work for 16 years. I just don't see how schools are really supporting the students. And for us, for immigrant communities, it's even much more challenging, much more difficult for the resources and so forth. And I'm talking about like severe disabilities, right? Not simply an IEP, that's a huge problem too. But within that context of working with in immigrant education, immigrant and so forth, the families are suffering and so are the students. So there is a huge need. There's a huge need for that population.
Thank you.
I'm just being honest. It's a huge need for support for students with disabilities, immigrant students with disabilities.
Yeah, I'd like to add, so as I was saying, like the New York Dream Act was drafted by youth in 2011. And part of the New York Dream Act, the original New York Dream Act that was drafted, the bill, it did ask for healthcare for all in that Dream Act. We know now that the New York Dream Act is not that. That was amended, it was taken out. But I do want to mention that, access to healthcare is so important. And that includes, right, folks with disabilities. And so I just want to mention, like, that is something we take into account in our space as well. But I do think we need to do a better job in including more folks in actions, right? In including them in our space as well. But I can mention very simple things, right? Like making sure our space has access so folks can get into our office, right? I mean, we're in a pandemic now. So something like an elevator, or making sure that your space has, access for folks with disabilities. I also want to mention that we are also supporting and uplifting NYPA's work. They're working on the HEAL Act, and like really bringing awareness to that. And ideally, the HEAL Act, what it would be, right? It's an Immigrants Families Act that would expand healthcare for all. It would give access to the Affordable Care Act, right? Because there's no lie, right? Undocumented folks are scared to go to the doctors, are scared to ask for resources. It is a struggle, right? So really uplifting the importance of access to healthcare, and also for all of us, right, to be more inclusive and to think about folks with disabilities. And I guess some of the ways that we do include that in our political education is also acknowledging like the efforts, right, that to get the ADA passed. So to getting rights for folks with disabilities, because it hasn't been that long ago that folks with disabilities have rights, right? That folks that are able-bodied have. So including that also in our political education, and letting youth know like the history that is there. And once again, right, mentioning that folks have power to advocate for themselves and also to create change for themselves.
And on our end, I think there could be more done to be more explicit about how we support students with disabilities within our work at ImmSchools. But I think going back to what someone here said, it's really about relationships for us, and providing teachers, administrators, the tools to be able to create relationships with students and better relationships rather with students and families. And that's important to us because from our conversations with immigrant students and families, and also from our own experiences being undocumented here, right? We know that immigrants are less trusting of institutions such as schools. And if you are a student with a disability, you need to get an IEP to get support, right? And you need to essentially trust the school system a little bit more, right? Which means parents need to be engaged with the school system a little bit more. And so on the teacher and administrator side, I think they need to be doing a better job building that trust and engaging students and families. And we hope that through our work, we're providing them with those resources and tools to be able to form better relationships with the communities that they serve.
Yeah, I wanted to add quickly from what Gabby said. That's all great. I didn't even know all that was going on. But also there is like a Know Your Rights, like an immigrant guide to the public schools and so forth. I think I'll share it with everyone. I think it's a great guide for families to know, like Jaime said about, you know, an IEP, going through an evaluation, everything that a parent would need to know, your rights in the public schools as an immigrant parent, an immigrant student with this disability. I think it's a little booklet. So we give it to families. We have it in Haitian Creole. They have it in different languages. I think that's the one thing that we're able to do so families can have access to something so they understand what their role is and how they can get the services that they deserve, that they need to have. Or else then they just don't have the information, and sometimes there isn't someone to give them the information. So that booklet is really, really important that communities can share within their communities.
Thank you very much, Darnell. And that actually, you know, provides a segue into our next question, which Laura asked a couple of questions about family engagement, right? So she said I'd love to hear more about how everyone is engaging parents and families in organizing efforts. She said, in my experience, one of the main ways change happens at the school district level is to have parents testify in front of their school board. And then another question was regarding education being a tool for access, are any panelists organizing around language access in K-12 schools? For example, the right for caregivers to get information in a language that they understand. So we know that, you know, Darnell just gave us an example of the Know Your Rights campaign. And then earlier she had given us an example of the Your School, Your Choice multilingual campaign. So I don't know if, you know, Darnell, if you want to talk more about how that explicitly addresses language access, and then anybody else wants to jump in on that.
Language access is limited. It's limited in New York City. So language access into the public school, this is something we've been working, our community, our youth, because we speak Haitian Creole. So even though our Haitian Creole is one of the top 10 languages the DOE recognizes, but we work, I'm sure Gabby, you're familiar, and everybody else with that. We work with other communities that that don't speak, they don't, people from Mexico who don't speak Spanish, right? Or people from South America or Central America that everybody thinks everybody speaks Spanish and they speak other languages. We have communities that work with in the Bronx, West African communities that are from Senegal, and they don't speak French, right? They speak so many other different languages, and those languages are not accessible to them. So that was a huge problem during the pandemic. We have to do better because we're not recognizing the different how wide language is, or how it's a huge problem for communities and families to even have access to everything, because they don't speak English yet, and then they don't speak the language that everybody thinks that they speak. So these families are at a loss. That's why one of the things we've been working on with the DOE is not everyone is internet savvy. Not everyone can go and get that information. So they have to do better. They have to reflect the language. They know those languages that our families speak. So they have to be able to call families for information. They have to be able to use different ways, right? To use text, to use the WhatsApp, to use different ways to get to the communities. They need to work with the community organizations in those communities that can speak that language and use those community organizations to support the families. This is something that they haven't done, but this is something that we need to do, and we need to do better in language access, because everybody thinks everybody speaks Spanish, or they speak French, or they speak Haitian Creole, because those are the top languages that are recognized, and they can always find someone in a school that can access those languages. That's not true. And there's a language line. Also, the language line doesn't represent all the languages. So we need to do much more so everyone can have access.
I can speak a little bit to sort of what we've done around engaging like parents and families. So one of the projects that we are now sort of really focused on is like this Interviewing Our Elders project, which is really focusing on uplifting the stories of undocumented API elders in the community, because those stories have never ever been documented, for one, and we actually don't know the needs of undocumented API elders. And so like what's sort of like coming up is that there's a lot of fear. And as we know, our youth are so connected, right, to their families, so connected to their communities. So really making sure that although we are a like youth-led group, that doesn't exclude folks. That doesn't exclude parents. That doesn't exclude older folks within the community. And so what we've sort of been doing is like trying to identify like these various needs, right? The way that this sort of connects to schools is sometimes like, if there is contact with police, if there's contact with any sort of like law enforcement, right, there's like a danger of like deportation, right? We know that for undocumented youth, right? There's a lot of danger, especially like now with COVID, like if there are sort of like home checks, right? Like wellness checks, that if there is contact with, the parent, that is also another risk, right? That is another danger for students, for our young people whose parents could end up in like deportation proceedings, right? Or so these are sorts of some of the ways that we've been trying to engage, really trying to assess the needs of specifically like undocumented API elders, parents, and using that to then see, okay, well, how can we engage folks and do something like intergenerational movement building, right? What does that look like for us? And yeah, that's sort of the work that we've been engaged in.
Awesome. And in our end at ImmSchools, we've consulted with schools across New York and Texas to be able to empower them to create these events with parents, right? And so as all of our organizations know, a lot of the work really comes from folks who are affected by issues that we host events on, right? And as a teacher, I know that an event that I can create is probably not going to be as well attended as an event that a popular parent within a school might be able to create, right? So we've really worked with schools to be able to form relationships with parents and really identify key stakeholders that are bringing on these events. And so, for instance, in some of our San Antonio schools, those parents, along with the work of the teachers that support them, have been able to stand up like what we call like weekly charlas, which are really just like listening sessions. You bring the topic that you want to talk about, and maybe something will come out of it, maybe it won't. But you know, at the end of the day, we were able to form relations as teachers and parents.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for addressing that really important question about parent engagement. And so then our next question is from Christina, who asks, as organizers, what have your experiences been in working towards goals that require cross-industry collaborating, like healthcare and education? I'm thinking about challenges this past year and how the immigrant community has been uniquely affected. What ways have you found to articulate the need for this collective work? So some of us, have talked about it, have mentioned it. I know Gabby mentioned that the original New York Dream Act, that it included healthcare for all, right? And so, are there any other campaigns or initiatives that you all are involved with that involve cross-industry collaboration?
One way that we've sort of like engaged folks during the pandemic, right? We know that so many folks, especially undocumented folks, lost their jobs. They're put in a lot of like precarious conditions, right? We know undocumented people are some of the folks who are most hard hit by the pandemic, right? So what we sort of came up with was an undocumented workers fund. We raised over $90,000, I think, and sort of gave it out to 500 families. A few last year, I believe in like October, November. And so that was sort of like one of the ways that we engaged with thinking about like workers' rights, right? Even though we are a youth movement and, a lot of the folks that we do engage with do work, a lot of the folks that we sort of ended up doing like mutual aid work with are older folks, right? Because once again, right, like youth are super connected to like their families, to their communities, right? Making sure that they're taken care of, making sure older folks are taken care of. So, we are able to sustain youth, right? That's sort of some of the ways. A lot of our work is super intersectional, right? We understand that work around immigration is also super tied with criminal legal work, right? That like both of these things intersect in so many different ways. And which is why it's when we're fighting against deportations, we're also fighting against police, right? So just thinking like all of these things are so interconnected. Gabby, pointed about, the HEAL Act, how work is being done on that end. So yeah, that is sort of how we've engaged over this past year with the pandemic, mutual aid being the core of the work that we do, we have done in the past, and try to continue to do.
Thank you, Simran. Anybody else like to address that before we move to the next question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think similar to Simran, like we also had a fund open for folks, acknowledging too, right, that youth have parents, and a lot of those parents did lose jobs. So yeah, the fund was really important during the pandemic, and the more funding there is, the best. And also like so great that the workers fund got passed and that folks can get funding now after a while. But I think also a big part, which Simran is also part of this work as well, is also acknowledging that parents and youth as well are in danger of deportation. So we were engaging in anti-deportation work back in the day, but as a directly impacted organization, it was really hard. But after analyzing, we realized that it's crucial work, and that we needed to get back on it. So we are part of the Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey coalition, and part of like our political education too, right, is also informing folks about the realities of ICE detention centers, what I like to call concentration camps, right? Because there is like human rights being violated in there. So that is some work that we're also engaging in, because it affects our youth, it affects their parents. We have folks in our spaces that are dealing with family separation and deportations and proceedings, right? So it's important that we also engage in that work, and engage in abolishing ICE. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gabby. And so now we've reached our last question from the audience, and it is from Martin, who asked, a large number of immigrant students in my classes are choosing work over school. Are there any organizations to guide these students who have exited educational institutions in their survival, right? So are there any organizations who can help students who've been pushed out of schools, who've left for probably for reasons that's not their own? So anything that you all know of or that your organization does to support these students who are out of school?
Yeah, I think it's some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? To understand cultures. These students are choosing work over school. It's not a choice, right? Because especially right now, we know that our communities are severely affected by the pandemic. These students have to work. Immigrant students, especially older immigrant students at the high school level, have to work. And sometimes, you know, the families that have lost jobs, so these students, they have to go and replace that income. So to me, it's how can we help these students get better jobs, right? To help them to understand like there's a bigger picture within that job and growth in the job, right? Because many students, we understand, are choosing careers instead of college, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's giving the students a space that they can be supportive. And sometimes it's going to work now and you can go to school later. There isn't a one way to do something. Many students are working because, well, I can't go to college right now, or I can't go into a career right now because I need to work right now, but I have a future plan. I do want to go and do this and do that. And I think it's the support often that's lacking for these students to continue on their journey, for them to be successful in their journey. So I think often it's not a choice, right, leaving school, because New York is tough. And it's all about, you know, when it comes to immigrant communities and immigrant families and students and so forth, this is the thing that always, that conversation always comes up. Do you want to pay rent or go to school? Okay, so it's like, okay, I need a home. Education, I can get that anywhere. And it's a reality. And we have to deal with the everyday realities of the student. And I think that's the problem of the public school system. Can these students go to school at night? We've been advocating for night school. There used to be 5 night programs, right, that students could go to. Older students, students who lack credit, immigrant students, they all disappeared. There's only 1 night school in Manhattan. So if you're in Queens, you have to go all the way to Manhattan. That's ridiculous. So we need more, we need Our students are diverse, right? It's not a one size fits all. That's the problem. So if you're working during the day, then you can go to school at night. So why not go to school on the weekends? All the buildings are closed. Those are the kind of things that we're pushing for.
So I have two thoughts that may not be super related to each other, but one is, some part of the work that we do at ImmSchools is certainly emphasizing the importance of education, which we all know, or the importance of a K through 12 education rather, but also acknowledging the fact that, for one reason or another, someone may not be able to complete their K through 12 education, right? But beyond that diploma, we also need to realize that the immigrant community is also a community of entrepreneurs, right? I had a mom who cleaned houses for 10 different people, right? She was her own businesswoman, right? And so part of the work that we do is also providing immigrant youth and families with the resources to be able to think of themselves as entrepreneurs in the most tactical, tangible way. It's thinking through how they can create their own LLC, right? So they can essentially make more money for themselves. And another thought that I have is beyond ImmSchools, I also work in the tech space, managing diversity partnerships for a startup. And there are some tremendous organizations out there that are working to upskill folks to take on careers in tech, right? So organizations like Pursuit and Marcy Lab Schools, for instance, are organizations that provide boot camps to folks who may not have had even completed a high school degree or a GED for them to be able to eventually take on, careers in software developing. So those are, all that to say is there are organizations that certainly provide those opportunities. And I think we may just have to do some legwork there.
I agree.
I want to add on to Darnell, right? And also to Jaime. You mentioned, right, like a lot of times, especially older immigrant folks, immigrant youth, they have to be in charge of taking care of their siblings and also contributing to the house. And a lot of folks in our space do have to take a lot of breaks from school. A lot of folks in our space had to drop out of high school. And I think that's also important. Like, while we focus on youth, it doesn't always mean that we're focusing only on youth that are in school. A lot of our programming also is like community building, right? It's so important to find community. And then also acknowledging that folks don't have working papers sometimes. So they do have to become, like Jaime said, they have to become their own bosses. They have to create their own jobs and be entrepreneurs. And that's something we've been seeing, right? Like street vendors, folks that work in construction, but are maybe not in a union, but are still working in construction, and all of these ways, right? And I think part of like the way that we try to include that now, we're trying to include it more in our space, is talking about trade schools. It's talking about how can folks choose a different alternative, maybe going to school for to become an electrician or a plumber, which would be less time, but they would get those certifications, and it is good paying jobs. But oftentimes, like, I think it goes back, right? Like, there's this pressure of getting degrees and this pressure of like going a certain pathway, especially as immigrant youth. But there is other options. And then I also just want to mention that we do have an entrepreneurship guide, which Jenna put in the chat. Thank you. And yeah, the entrepreneurship guide is a step-by-step guide on how folks can start their own businesses, how folks can start, open their own ITN numbers, and how they can, become their own boss, create their own jobs. And yeah, I think that was so important to point out.
Thank you
Jaime,
so much.
thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Gabby. I'm going to turn it over to Jenna, who's going to have some closing announcements.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to share my screen real quick and try and present this while I'm talking. So just first of all, thank you again to our panelists, Darnell from Flanbwayan, Simran from Raise, Gabby from the New York State Youth Leadership Council, and Jaime from ImmSchools. Y'all shared so much wisdom. And if you want to stay in touch, can folks see my screen?
No,
Ah,
no, we can't see the screen anymore.
the presenting part didn't work. Okay, now can you see it?
Sure, yeah, you can keep it like that.
So I'll keep my screen up while I'm talking. Please take a picture, find these organizations online, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and get connected and support their work, both by connecting folks you know and youth with them, but also monetarily if you are able to do so. And once again, thank you all so much. I'm going to leave it up for another 5 seconds if folks want to get this picture, and then I'm going to actually turn it over to Cynthia to close us out.
Great. Thank you again, everyone, for being present, for asking so many questions. It was such an engaging conversation, and for folks for answering and being thoughtful and mindful in those responses. What I'll just briefly share as we close out is ways in which you can also connect with CUNY-I. So this was one of 5 workshops that we've had so far that is facilitated and organized by members of our team. So Khadidra and Jenna here organized this workshop. And our last workshop of our series will be next month, June 16th. And this will be fostering conversations across borders at the intersection of immigration and education. So you may have noticed that all the workshops have the theme of the intersection of immigration and education. And so this one was organizing, and the next one will be fostering conversations across borders. It's still in the works. We have some folks from Guatemala who will be joining us. And so we're excited to have this conversation. If you're interested in attending, if you're here, you've likely already submitted the workshop series registration form, so you'll be getting an email reminder of that. But please feel free to continue sharing this across your networks and to other folks so they can attend as well. A way in which you can share some of these, the workshop that's coming up, as well as other resources that we have, is you can follow us on social media as well. We have a wonderful social media manager, Tashi, who organizes and coordinates and creates all the content for this. And so we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. The workshop information is listed on there, and so you're welcome to share, to follow, and to distribute in whichever way you'd like. If you'd also like to be included in our listserv, if you go on our website, CUNY.org, you'll be able to see at the very bottom of the page, signing up for our newsletter, and that's how you can get more updates and information from us. But that's all I wanted to share from our end. Thank you again, everyone, for attending.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.